out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Good evening, I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. State of the Nation tonight. Storm Gareth, as the Meteorological Office have officially named it, hit the BBC over the weekend. All it suggested to me is it's time to privatise the public broadcaster altogether. I'll be debating that shortly. Unlucky strikes continue as junior doctors begin their 3 consecutive days of collective inaction. We have our favourite socialist here to go into bat on a sticky wicket. And have we lost our marbles? The Elgin marbles specifically? Well, the Prime Minister says no, but the former Chancellor, George Osborne, now chairman of the British Museum, who actually owns them on our behalf, thinks they should be returned to the Parthenon in Athens. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. We asked the people if the Elgin marbles should be returned, and here's a taste of what they had to say.
No.
Bold words from the gentleman there. State of the Nation starts now. We're also hearing from our illustrious panel, the acclaimed and celebrated historian Dr. David Starkey and the equally acclaimed socialist Stephen Pound. As ever, I want to hear from you. Get in touch by emailing mailmog@gbnews.uk. But before all of that, as always, it's been a busy day, and here to keep us up to date is Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. The top story on GB News tonight. The Prime Minister says it's the right decision for the government to pledge more money into bolstering the UK's defences. Number 10 announced today defence spending will rise by almost £5 billion over 2 years. That comes as Mr Sunak met his Australian counterpart Anthony Albanese in San Diego ahead of unveiling a major new AUKUS defence pact, as it's known, between the UK, the United States and Australia. Plans to be announced in conjunction with President Joe Biden include supplying nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. Ahead of that meeting, Mr Sunak praised the current relationship between the United Kingdom and America.
Our relationship with America economically is very strong. Our exports are growing massively anyway, and we are concluding agreements with states. Remember, many American states are as big as most countries, and actually increasing our economic ties at a state level is something that can be really good for Britain and good for jobs, and so we're getting on and doing that.
Well, here at home, the government's illegal migration bill is currently being debated right now in the House of Commons. The legislation is hoping to allow for the removal of Channel migrants from the UK. Under the proposals, those attempting to cross the English Channel would be banned from future re-entry and blocked from applying for UK citizenship. Labour says the bill will make the chaos in the Channel worse, but the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, says stopping small boats is her top priority.
The British public know that border security is national security, that illegal migration makes us all less safe. They know that the financial and social costs of uncontrolled and illegal migration are unsustainable. They know that if our borders are to mean anything, we must control who comes into this country and the terms under which they remain here.
Within the last hour, South Wales police have said the body of a man has been recovered from the scene of a suspected gas explosion in Swansea. 3 people are known to be in hospital following the incident, which happened in the Morriston area this morning. Officers say 2 properties were extensively damaged and neighbouring buildings have also been affected. They've set up a cordon and are asking the public to stay away from the area. And also news just coming to us this evening, the disgraced pop star Gary Glitter has been recalled to prison after breaching his licence conditions. The 78-year-old had been released last month after serving only half of his 16-year sentence for sexually abusing 3 schoolgirls. In a statement, the Ministry of Justice said protecting the public is its #1 priority. We're back in an hour with more. Now back to Jacob.
O'Sullivan's Law, dreamt up by a former advisor to Margaret Thatcher, says that all organisations that are explicitly right-wing will, over time, become left-wing. This is the context that explains the retreat from Reithian principles to inform, educate and entertain, a mission enshrined in the BBC's Royal Charter, but that's now largely been put to one side in favour of a progressive political agenda, one that likes having a go at the government, likes to take a pop at Brexit, isn't in favour of what so many of the British people are in favour of. That's where the BBC is now. Its motto at Broadcasting House, its Temple of the Arts and Muses, it is prayed may incline the ear of the people to whatsoever things are beautiful and honest. Beautiful and honest. We don't get a lot of that, and we don't get much treading of the path of wisdom and uprightness either. But the BBC, it seems to me, has become more political. Even in its day-to-day programmes, its dramas and its soaps are inculcated with a view of the world that may be popular in the fashionable Islingtonian dining rooms, but aren't true for the rest of the United Kingdom. Left-wing orthodoxies are thrown at us, even in things like EastEnders. Brexit is unpopular. Promoting the sexual revolution and the more extreme climate change agenda is all in the BBC's meat and drink. But this is a problem, not because of it being wrong or being bad or being a point of view that people shouldn't hold. People are entitled to their views. I'm all in favour of freedom of speech. I say this again and again. People must be free to express their views, even if they offend. The problem is that the BBC is funded by a medieval-style poll tax. Think of what Richard II had to do as a schoolboy when, on Blackheath, he faced down the poll tax, the revolt that had come about because of trying to tax people unfairly and improperly. This is what the BBC does. We all have to pay it, whether we watch the BBC or not, if we watch any live television. But actually, it's held the BBC back. Let me explain. The BBC was at one point in its history one of the great broadcasters in the world. It's great by reputation, it was great by revenue, it was great by range. But in recent years, it has been static, stagnant even, whilst others have gone a lot higher and faster. So the BBC's revenue, predominantly poll tax, licence fee derived, has been about £5 billion a year each year since 2010. Compare that to Netflix. Netflix had just over half the BBC's revenue a decade ago, at about £3 billion, and a small 90 million profit. By 2022, Netflix was at 5 times the revenue of the BBC and was making lots of money as well. Sky, which didn't exist, well, nor did Netflix exist, but Sky didn't exist until the end of the 1980s, now has more than 3 times the revenue of the BBC. And this is important because Sky has bought up all the sports reporting. Most of the football is on Sky, not on the BBC. The BBC may have a very expensive match of the day, but it doesn't have the day-in, day-out Premier League matches because they're on Sky. Why? Because Sky has £16.5 billion in revenue, the BBC only about £5 billion. Netflix is making the most expensive dramas. Why? Because it's got £26 billion of revenues against £5 billion for the BBC. So this great national institution has been responsible for its own decline through the comfort blanket of the licence fee that has meant that it hasn't needed to get out there and raise revenue for itself. Look at the iPlayer. Brilliant invention. Many of it use it. But it's free if you're a licence fee payer. That should have been used for revenue so that the BBC could be more competitive and more effective. And if it did this, then like the American broadcasters like CNN and ABC, it could be on the left. And that would be fine because we wouldn't all be paying a tax for it. Now, there are bits that the BBC, like the World Service, that receive some subsidy from the government. They're different, they're separate. They are only part licence fee funded, but the main bulk of it needs to be freed up so that the BBC competes, because if the BBC competes, it will do better, it can regain its position as a globally leading media company, and it can have its views, it can have its annoying lefty views, and it can leave other people to have sensible right-wing views. And then no one would mind because it wouldn't be paid for by a poll tax and they wouldn't be prosecuting primarily women who don't always remember to pay this poll tax. This is a real challenge for the BBC. We don't need it as a state-funded broadcaster. We want to have a great British company doing well, which would do much better if its resources were less limited and it was less dependent on the comfort blanket. So if you're of the Mr. Lineker persuasion, go to the BBC, talk about left-wing things, tweet left-wing things, disagree with the government. That's great. And we'll keep the Reithian principles at GB News and on State of the Nation. As always, I want to know what you at home think. Do you like paying the licence fee, or would you rather move to a different system? Email me, mailmog@gbnews.uk. I'm now delighted to be joined to discuss this by the principal of South College, Durham, Professor Tim Luckhurst, who was also formerly of the BBC. Tim, thank you so much for joining me this evening. I think you don't agree with me. Are you in favour of maintaining the licence fee? But more importantly, perhaps, do you think I'm wrong that the licence fee has ended up being a comfort blanket for the BBC that has kept its revenues down when other media outlets have been able to overtake it?
I don't agree with you, Jacob. No, I think that the licence fee has served the licence payer and the British Broadcasting Corporation, a great British national institution, which is regarded with enormous respect around the world. Indeed, one of the principal tools of British cultural diplomacy. I think that the licence fee may have to change. I would like to see it related to the ability to pay in future, but I would gladly pay £500 a year for my BBC access just to listen to BBC Radio 4. That's my favourite output. So I think you are wrong about that, and I think that you caricature the BBC. The BBC is a truly great cultural institution. It is revered around the world. There are people listening to BBC output in Ukraine now, in parts of the world where totalitarian governments rule, in Myanmar, for example, people who depend upon the BBC. As a young BBC journalist abroad, I remember meeting people in Ceausescu's Romania in 1989 who spoke English because they'd been listening to BBC World Service, though they'd never been able to leave their own country. So I think that you underestimate the standing of this great organisation and that you would diminish it greatly if you were to privatise it. You would also, by the way, strip many of its competitors in the UK market, commercial competitors, of advertising revenue because they would be terrified to compete for advertising revenue with the BBC, and I know because they've told me so.
But the World Service is a rather special case because up until 2010 it was funded by the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office is still parts funded. It's not mainly, and it's just got another £20 million today from taxpayers. So there is a funding mechanism beyond the licence fee for the World Service. But you made the point that you would happily pay £500 a year for Radio 4. Isn't that the point, that there are other sources of revenue and that the licence fee has actually meant the BBC doesn't have the money it needs to compete in an increasingly expensive global media market?
Well, I think that the BBC probably does need to adapt to a much more competitive market than it's been accustomed to at any time since Lord Reith famously launched it as a private company back in 1923. But I don't think that it would help the country or the BBC if the BBC were to be privatised in the way that you suggest. I think that what we are looking for is a new way of funding the BBC, which remains universal, but better related to the ability to pay. I recognise there are many people who use the BBC much less intensively than I do, and who earn a great deal less than I do. And I believe in fair taxation. I think that's a good Conservative principle. And I think that people should pay...
Sorry to interrupt, but why would it be fair for somebody who doesn't watch the BBC but earns a lot of money to pay for it, when you don't have to pay for Netflix if you don't watch it, you don't have to pay for Sky if you don't watch it? I don't see how fairness comes into this. That when there was only one channel, indeed, even when there were only 4 channels, almost everybody watched quite a lot of the BBC if they had a television. But that simply isn't true anymore. Lots of people with televisions will hardly watch the BBC now.
There are some institutions, Jacob, which are genuinely emblematic of British values, and I think that the BBC is one of them. I think that the BBC does deliver a lot of the impartial journalism that you say you want, but claim doesn't exist. But I hear impartial journalism on BBC channels day in, day out. I hear Conservatives being challenged robustly. I hear the opposition being challenged robustly. And what I want to avoid is the BBC becoming a punch bag in a culture war between right and left. I'm very much a moderate. I believe absolutely in fair debate. I despise the notion that we should seek to cancel people for having views with which we disagree. I am, in fact, a member of the Free Speech Union, although I consider myself to be a liberal with a small L. And for all of these reasons, I regard the BBC as an institution which, whilst it can occasionally make mistakes, and which certainly made a mistake by suspending Gary Lineker, rather than just bringing him in and telling him to abide by the editorial guidelines, which is what Tim Davies should have done in the first place. But I do believe that the BBC is a truly valuable institution, and one whose absence or privatisation would diminish us greatly. Something I can assure you that Margaret Thatcher agreed with, because although when she came to office, she was very keen to do something radical to the BBC, she very quickly recognised, although her husband Dennis kept a picture of Broadcasting House leaning to the left on its wall at Downing Street, that in fact the BBC was worth building. She was absolutely right.
But when she became Prime Minister, there were only 3 channels, so it's rather a different world. Look, I accept your point. There are some very impartial people on the BBC. I think the current political correspondent and his predecessor were. But Gary Lineker tweeting makes people think that the BBC backs the left. Isn't that part of the problem?
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's why it was so important that Tim Davies prevented him from continuing to tweet about issues of current party political controversy. And although Gary Lineker has not made a formal apology in public, he did thank Tim Davies for the way that he'd handled things over the weekend, and he has recognised that he must not broadcast views or tweet views.
Thank you very much, Professor Luckhurst. I'm extremely grateful. But I also want to hear from you. Let me know at mailmog@GBNews. After the break, it's the junior doctors' strike, industrial inaction as it's correctly known, and it's meant to last until Wednesday. One of our panellists has a degree in trade union studies, so he'll be the real expert to tell us about it. Don't go anywhere, unless, of course, you too have a degree in trade union studies, in which case I vaunt and quit my site.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway...
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nah, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. So Greg says, now that the Lineker supporters have got their way, isn't it about time they concentrate their efforts in defending J.K. Rowling? Or does free speech only matter when it's the left's narrative? I think, Greg, you will find that you're right. It only matters when it's the left's narrative. Norman. Now, this is in association football language, so I hope you will follow it better than I do. The BBC has scored an own goal and deserves a red card. I think that's a bit like hitting your own wicket. From all those who no longer want to subsidise that outmoded, biased, overweight bureaucracy and remnant from a past age. I like that. Outmoded, biased, overweight bureaucracy is a phrase I think I'm going to put in a speech at some point. And Alan, agree 100%, the Beeb should be privatised and the licence fee scrapped. Thank you for that, and keep sending in your views. Today, junior doctors started their 72-hour striking stint as thousands of appointments and surgeries are cancelled across the United Kingdom. This came as the British Medical Association came under fire for advertising a claim that junior doctors earn less per hour than coffeehouse pret-a-manger employees, because it turned out to be untrue. Personally, I was a bit suspicious to begin with. I wouldn't particularly trust a British business that pretends to be French, especially when we had coffee houses in England a good 20 years before the French did, back in the 17th century. I enjoyed going to them then, and I still enjoy a nice cup of Altarica now. But Pret aren't here to defend themselves, and they could have called themselves a nice English name. Never mind. But there are legitimate questions over the rates of pay of junior doctors, but there are also questions about the fact that the NHS employer pension contribution is quadruple that of the average in the private sector. But I'm delighted now to be joined by former GP, Dr. Robert Lefevre. Robert, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Do you think they're right to be going on strike? Have they got a case, or do you feel that as a doctor you have an overriding duty to patients?
I think there are two answers to this. The first is, yes, I very much agree that doctors have an overriding duty to their patients. I do totally agree with that. But the doctors who are going on strike don't know their history. Some years ago, Canadian doctors went on strike and the death rate for patients went down. How about that? That's the history. Anyway, supposing politicians were to go on strike, would the country run itself? Well, it might.
Well, they did. They did in Belgium for a year, didn't they? They didn't have a government for 15 months, and it did perfectly well for a bit.
Yeah, well, that's the issue. That going on strike is a dangerous weapon to use because it might backfire. Now, as far as salaries are concerned, I worked in the NHS full-time for 17 years and loved it. I just loved doing the work. And my salary, as the equivalent of an F1, the junior doctor, my salary was the equivalent of £10,000 a year. The current F1 doctors get 25,000. So it's gone up from 10,000 to 25,000 now. And it could go up to 100,000. They still wouldn't be satisfied. So the issue is not a financial one, it's a philosophical one. What do you want?
And the philosophical one is that doctors shouldn't go on strike because they have a duty to their patients, yes, and that's what they signed up to when they started training as a doctor.
That's what I believe. That's what I did. I couldn't possibly go on strike. As I say, I loved the work. I loved the patients. And some doctors said to me, you loved your patients? I said, well, yes, of course. I knew them very well. And I loved the work. I loved doing it. Now, that seems to have disappeared from the landscape at the present time, and I think that's wrong and also very sad for the patients and also for the doctors.
Well, thank you, Dr. Robert. I share your view. I feel that way towards my constituents. I think those of us in these sorts of roles are very privileged to have the relationship that we do with the individuals, yes, we seek to serve. But I'm now joined by my absolutely first-class panel, Dr. David Starkey and our socialist friend, Stephen Pound.
Good evening, comrade.
So, Stephen, I mistakenly said you had a degree in trade union studies. You had a diploma which then led to your economics degree.
Absolutely correct, yes.
I can correct the record. You believe, as a Labour member, that the right to withdraw your labour is fundamental. Do you think the junior doctors are right to exercise it in these circumstances?
I think they're making some fundamental mistakes here. I always thought it slightly odd to think of the BMA as a trade union in the first place. Anyway, you don't think of them representing the horny-handed sons of the soil somehow, but the fact they are a trade union in the same way that, the Law Society is. But look, what we have, the issue we have here is that I've never met a poor doctor, but I've never met a rich junior doctor. And I spent 10 years as a porter at the Middlesex Hospital, and it's extraordinary the number of medics there who came from extremely privileged backgrounds. The rate of pay was irrelevant, but that was between 1970 and 1980. Nowadays, if we want to encourage more people to go into medicine, we should be looking at the entry point. We should be looking at subsidies, bursaries, assistance, help at the early stage. Then once they've graduated, once they've qualified, once they've finished their junior houseman year, once they become consultants or whatever, they will be fine. So I think, firstly, we need to actually define our terms. It's a good trade union principle. What do we actually want? Not just when do we want it, but it should be specifically at the early stage, because later on in the day, to be frank, they're not doing badly.
So, David, they want 35%. Do you think, as Dr. Robert was saying to us, if they went on strike, we might all be healthier anyway? That was quite a claim from history.
It's called iatrogenic illness, isn't it? In other words, that you actually suffer from doctors, and there's quite a lot of evidence that that's the case. But can I first actually begin by counting what Stephen said? There is gross over-demand for medical school places. We're turning away. And I think of the order of, is it 3 or 4 times the number of places that are available? So there is no case, in other words, for increasing early pay in the fact that all of these people queuing up to become medics. I think the more important thing is the point you made. That is to say, the duty of care. Again, Stephen was giving examples of his earlier career. I'll give one of mine. When I was teaching people like Stephen, I was a member briefly of another one of these confused organisations, the Association of University Teachers, except that's not a professionally regulatory body, as the BMA is and the Law Society is, whatever, where there's a profound confusion. I resigned from it when I was told not to mark exam papers, because it simply seems to me to be improper to visit on the patient, the student, your quarrel with your employer. It is, I'm going to use the word, I think, immoral. And I think the behaviour of the junior doctors is profoundly foolish.
OK, so what do you do if you feel you're not paid enough? What other avenue do you have if you're a junior doctor?
What other avenue do you have? You would negotiate via your profession. You would then ask, I think, what none of them do, fundamental questions about the nature of the organisation that they work for. These doctors are fundamentally complaining about two things. They're complaining about the nature of the organisation. They feel oppressed, they feel not able to control their lives and whatever. And on the other hand, they're complaining about pay. All the time, however, they are loud in the praise of this wonderful thing called the NHS that pays them badly and treats them badly. And they're showing no sign of fundamental thought. In fact, they're just behaving like any other boneheaded trade unionist.
Stephen,
and clamouring for more money.
Let Stephen defend boneheaded trade unionism.
I think we could drift off into a debate about the NHS, and I'm perfectly happy to do it. But look, what they're talking about at the moment is pay and conditions. They say that they're overworked. Now, what we need to be doing, absolutely right, is negotiating. We're talking about separate medical schools all around the country. We should be actually talking, or the medical schools should collectively be talking to Stephen Barclay, to the Secretary of State for Health. We should actually be talking and negotiating. I mean,
shouldn't a junior doctor be overworked? There's
something wrong with the structure. I genuinely believe there is.
But they're not overworked because the 48-hour week applies to junior doctors. They may have been overworked 20 years ago.
They are now badly trained.
No doctor clocks off in the afternoon or the evening when he's still got a patient. They don't simply say, drop your stethoscope and walk out the door. That just isn't realistic.
I think quite a few of them do. I think we need to be.
For the next 3 days, they're going to drop their stethoscopes. They're going
to drop everything, and they're also
not going to put them on.
They're also going to do it in a fashion which is deliberately designed to cause the most disruption, which means they're deliberately designing it to injure patients, dying, undergoing cancer treatment as much as. I'm sorry, but doesn't this destroy everything that is valuable and socially valuable about a doctor?
Before we finish, because Stephen, you're not unsympathetic to people who go on strike, but I get the impression that you think this strike is a strike too far.
Yeah, no, I think the idea, you cannot, just as much as you cannot be in favour of every single person being an immigrant to this country, you cannot be in favour of every single striker. Don't forget, I can remember when the dockers came out in support of Enoch Powell. There's plenty of strikes that I wouldn't support. I think this one is badly structured, badly aimed, badly targeted, and it's going to end badly.
Well, there's a good deal of unity tonight, so thank you to my distinguished panel.
Stop to that.
We will stop to that later. Still ahead, the two wisest men in Christendom will remain in the studio as the nation asks for the umpteenth time, have we lost our marbles? Don't mog me off.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. John, you win tonight's prize, hero of State of the Nation. Junior doctors went on strike in Canada. The death rate dropped. Gary Lineker was suspended. The ratings went up. The numbers speak for themselves. I just think that's a brilliant message. Anne, the NHS staff suffered more than anyone during the pandemic. Surely we can understand their frustration. And that's true. They worked very hard during the pandemic. And Mike, does anyone else think that those youngsters on the picket lines today look as though they have just come from protesting against the oil companies whilst gluing themselves to the road? That's a fascinating point, whether they've been doing that or not. But over the weekend, speculation was fizzing over the loaning actually returning, because they'd never have come back, and a loan is normally meant to be repaid, usually with interest, and I'm not sure what the interest would be, but never mind. The loaning of the Elgin marbles back to Athens. The chairman of the British Museum, a man better known for once being Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. George Osborne, is desperate to lose his marbles. He wants them returned. But just today, the Prime Minister quelled the rumours and said there were no such plan for their return. So, discussing this earlier with my producers, one of them mentioned a key argument in favour of their return, that the marbles are split in half and it would be better if they were unified. Well, that's simple. We can make space for them in the British Museum. The Greeks could allow us to unify them here because we've looked after them so well. Anyway, enough of my views. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. We asked the people about their marbles. Should they be sent to Athens?
I think the Elgin marbles should be returned to Greece. They belong to Greece. They were part of a found treasure that were brought over here and displayed, and I don't think they belong to us. I think they're worldwide heritage things, and that's not particularly something that Britain should have.
Yes and no, veering towards no. I think they're a beautiful item of great historical value, and I understand that they want them back. But I think at this point we've had them for so long that I think, maybe there should be, because I think both, I think maybe there should be some kind of agreement of joint ownership, and they can be shared in both countries, because we've had them for ages. We found them, but it's also their history. And
no, I think they have a proper home in the British Museum. We take care of them, and I think we value them and protect them for the nation.
Well, still with me, England's favourite socialist, Mr. Stephen Pound, and Dr. David Starkey. David, I was just wondering whether you should either be made chairman of the British Museum or at least be an exhibit in the British Museum.
But neither are us.
Never an exhibition.
Especially in the Greek gallery, where you have to take all your clothes off.
Well, I think we don't need to go down there. We're before the watershed.
Not quite 9 o'clock. Indeed.
Are you in favour of the Elgin marbles going back to Athens?
No. On several grounds. The arguments for their return are completely misconceived. They are fundamentally that these have something to do with modern Greece. They're the foundation of its culture. This is nonsense. There is absolutely no connection between the culture of ancient Athens and that of modern Athens. There are kind of 19th century reinventions, point one. Point two, the marbles acquire, and this is really important, the marbles acquire their meaning here. These things, far too much of the debate is about whose property they are. Now, this is, of course, founded on the debate over the return of Jewish artefacts, things that were owned by Jews that have been confiscated by the Nazis. And that is a false argument. It's a false argument with the Rosetta Stone, most of these things. These are not real estate, they're cultural property. And the place that gave them cultural meaning is here, within the context of metropolitan Western civilization. And the marbles which simply sat, rotting, peeling, being turned into lime, blown up, destroyed in Athens, when they came here, they trigger the Greek revival of the 19th century, the explosion of interest in Greek culture, buildings everywhere. Their meaning is here. And they should remain here as part of that extraordinary explosion of the Western mind, which the British Museum represents.
Stephen, how do you answer that? What is the response to David's compelling view?
Yeah, I dare to disagree. There's a very powerful case to be made that the Parthenon frieze was actually on 4 sides of the building. Therefore, nobody's actually seen it in one piece. But look, when I visited there, I remember somebody saying, we're going to see the trousers of antiquity, where they worship the goats, until I realised we're actually talking about the treasures of antiquity, where they worship the gods. But that didn't put me off. Look, as far as I'm concerned, the Vatican has given a large section of the frieze back to Athens. We should do the same. It belongs together, because I wouldn't like it if Westminster Abbey was being looked after in Khartoum or something. I just wouldn't like it. It's part of our history here. And I think the idea that the Lord Byron and the whole explosion in the Pan-Hellenic movement and everything in the early 19th century is somehow linked to the Parthenon frieze, I simply don't buy. Look, as far as I'm concerned, the bottom line is we need all the...
You obviously have never read Byron.
I think we need all the friends we can get.
Where do you stop? Because Charles I's collection was sold off and was dispersed abroad, and some of it remains abroad.
Henry VIII Holbein is in the Prado.
Walpole's collection was
really
sold to Catherine the Great.
Absolutely.
No, I'm sorry. What is comparable is things like the Koh-i-Noor, which is a standalone, and Cleopatra's Needle there. I mean, I don't hear anybody from Egypt saying they want Cleopatra's Needle back, because it's a standalone piece of art, a piece of work. The Parthenon frieze is a totality, it's a whole. It should be together. I'd have some sympathy with your argument that they should give it to us and the Vatican should provide it with us, but I don't really buy that in the long term. I think it should be together. We have a perfectly adequate facsimile within the British Museum. I've been to see some of their work.
They've got a perfectly adequate facsimile in Greece. That argument surely works both ways.
I don't think so, because I think it's where it came from. First principles, it's Greek.
But say there is no... Greek is a concept which did not exist. It was a creation of a specific society long, long dead. What you're doing is adducing the kind of arguments you would normally very much opposed to. You're introducing a nationalistic argument, which is what the Greeks do, which is why they feel so passionately about it, that this is the foundation of our culture. Nonsense. Greece does not depend on ancient Athens, it depends on the Orthodox Church, which is why democracy, by the way, has been such a very, very uncertain inhabitant of Greece ever since it was founded.
And it depends on 19th century diplomacy, which created it as the state that it now is, as it left the Ottoman Empire.
I mean, the Greek word, Hellas, for Greek, it existed long before that. So I don't think we can actually say we created it. But look,
but the polity of Greece, as it currently is, the modern state.
When Lord Elgin may or may not have bought them,
he got permission from the Ottomans.
From the Pasha or from the Sublime Porte. But does that really count nowadays? Does that mean to say that when William the Conqueror was in charge of this country, if somebody had done a deal with him, we should observe that forever?
For heaven's sake, the Bayeux Tapestry, which has at least as much meaning in terms of England as the marbles, is of course in Bayeux. There is no problem about this, and it seems to me that you're completely ignoring the big argument that I put forward, which is about cultural meaning. And it's of course even stronger with something like the Rosetta Stone, where its entire understanding, its interpretation happens here.
I think the French found it, though, didn't they?
The French find it. Yeah. It's then brought back here by the British, and then there's this extraordinary Anglo-French race in which both sides help enormously actually to decipher the thing. But it's But it's a product of Western culture. In other words, the whole concept of history, in the sense that we understand it, is Western.
And the fact remains, sir, that the Parthenon frieze is enormously significant in modern Greece. It's not just one particular party.
It's just because they agitate about it.
So who are we to say to the Greeks that we do not respect your desire to have this vital piece of your history united? I mean, what right have we got to say that? And to say that if we would then open the floodgates to be handing back everything else, let's deal with everything on a case-by-case basis. As far as I'm concerned, the Parthenon Frieze is important to Greece. We should respect that. They need it more than we do.
I'm biting my lip to allow Stephen the final word, but that is it from my brilliant panellists. I said they'd be brilliant, and they were very good tonight, but we'll see them, I hope, next week. Coming up next, the Prime Minister has met with our AUKUS allies, and the former Australian High Commissioner and ex-Foreign Minister is here next. Don't go anywhere, unless, of course, you're my panellists. You need to go home for dinner.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512,
Virgin Media Channel 604,
Freesat Channel 216,
Freeview Channel 236,
and YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to State of the Nation with me, Jacob Rees-Mogg. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. An anonymous viewer, probably from the Greek embassy, says they should be returned. They're not ours. It's not a big deal, but they are Greek and belong there. We've done our bit looking after them. Be proud of what we have done. Amanda says the Parthenon marbles should be returned to Greece. If there were a copy in the British Museum, no one would probably know. Well, other than GB viewers who had been informed about this. And Alan says, no, they should not, because they were saved from destruction by Lord Elgin. Plus, the British Museum is a custodian for the world. Well, that leads me on to talking about Britain's place in the world. On this side, on my side of the Brexit debate, we said Britain could exist as a key international player outside of the European Union as a sovereign nation. And we were poo-pooed for that. We were called Little Englanders. We were warned we would become an irrelevant post-colonial archipelago longing for a scintilla of the significance we once enjoyed. Well, the doubters have once again been proved wrong. Today, the Prime Minister met the US President, Joe Biden, and the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, for the AUKUS talks in California. This security pact enables Britain to play a key role on the international stage with allies like the US and Australia combating the ever-looming threat of China. Plus, of course, there's the fun that it winds up the French. I'm now joined by somebody extremely distinguished, who for many years I addressed as His Excellency because he was the Australian High Commissioner. I think I'm now allowed to call you Alexander. Alexander Downer, former High Commissioner and very long-serving Australian Foreign Secretary. You had a piece in The Telegraph this morning which would have warmed the hearts of every patriotic Briton because you said this is Britain taking back its place in the world.
Yes, there's a sense, and there has been a sense over the last 2 or 3 years that Britain is finally back. I think all of us, particularly my father's generation, were pretty sad to see the 1960s withdrawal from east of Suez when the UK joined what became known as the EU in 1973. Then Europe became the total priority, particularly of the civil service, the FCO and so on. So the old traditional relationships with countries like Australia, which, by the way, I think is the country that socially has the most in common with the UK of all countries in the world, these countries were cast aside. There was a 17-year gap between the visit to Australia by a British Foreign Secretary and William Hague as the Foreign Secretary finally going there. So what we've seen now is a real turnaround. The Prime Minister is over there in San Diego today signing this agreement with President Biden and Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister. It's about the UK making a defence contribution to the Indo-Pacific, recognising that balancing the power of a rising China is a critical global priority, and the UK sees itself as having a role in addressing that.
And it's an expression of strength and determination, isn't it? Because Australia was the first country, really, to reveal to everybody how dangerous China was and took action, which then led to quite severe potential consequences for your economy. But that led the world to understand what a risk China was to the rest of us. And Australia and the UK aren't the US, we're not superpowers, but when we combine particularly, we can have a disproportionate influence.
Well, we are very, particularly the UK, but the two of us are very significant powers. And, you know, in a troubled world, you need all the friends you can get. And for Australia, the UK is, you know, is an intimate friend, is kith and kin, as they used to say. And let us not disregard the importance of that my ancestors came from Portsmouth, for example, in the 1830s. I mean, this is about the way we live and the way we think. So we need to be together as much as we can. When the two of our countries get together, you know, we can be really significant. And working here with the Americans in building a new generation of Australian nuclear-powered submarines is going to contribute to something that's very important to Australia, and that is a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, not allowing China to turn the Indo-Pacific region into a kind of Chinese lake, but for the power there to be properly balanced. And the UK is not turning its back on these issues, despite the war in Ukraine. The UK is saying we are a global power, we matter, and we are going to contribute to a better world, not leave that to others.
And before we move on to migration, we were very lucky in Boris Johnson and Scott Morrison having the foresight to do this deal.
Yes, well, so here are two former Prime Ministers reviled, of course, these days, Boris Johnson and Scott Morrison. Scott Morrison having lost the election last year as Boris Johnson lost his job last year. But these two and President Biden put this, this deal together. And so, you know, when you think of their lasting legacies, you don't think whether you like them or what Partygate was about, or these things pass in history. You remember what was substantial about their legacies. For Scott Morrison, AUKUS is going to be one. for Boris as well, obviously, Brexit particularly, but AUKUS will be one of his legacies.
And this evening, when we finish, I'm going back to the Palace of Westminster, which people can see behind my shoulder, to vote for our immigration bill, Suella Braverman's immigration bill. We can also learn from Australia, can't we? Because you were instrumental in the government that solved the immigration problem for Australia.
So this is what academics would call a wicked problem. That means there is no attractive solution. All of the solutions, all of the options are unattractive. So you have to think through, how am I going to stop people embarking at, the behest of people smugglers on these incredibly perilous journeys in tiny little boats across stretches of sea? How am I going to stop this? So I think the legislation that Suella Braverman is introducing today is a good step towards stopping them. It's very important that legislation passes through the Parliament. I think the Rwanda option can work as well.
Well, I think people have been seeing the pictures of the House of Commons debating this as we've been debating it here. But thank you very much, and I hope we'll see you again. That's all from us. Up next, Dan Wootton is back. Dan, this is our maiden handover. Let's make a good one. What have you got for us?
Oh, Jacob Rees-Mogg, you're a dark horse, aren't you, Jacob? When I was at your house just before the launch of this show, you were playing down your television skills, and I have to say, you are quite a pro. I've actually been here watching the past 2 weeks. I am now such a fan of Jacob Rees-Mogg's State of the Nation, and I think you've done a brilliant job. We're continuing the BBC theme tonight.
Well, that's excellent. It'll be an exciting programme, and I'm sure everyone will stay with you. But they want to hear the weather. That's their highlight of the evening, to find out that it'll be glorious in Somerset. I'll be back tomorrow from 8 p.m. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this has been State of the Nation.
Hello, and welcome to your evening weather with me, Luke Mile. Now, as we head through this evening, it is going to turn colder across the United Kingdom. We've got rain heading southwards, with frost, ice and snow to follow. And that's down to this cold front. You can see we've had tightly packed isobars today. That's brought a lot of strong wind around across the country. But as that cold front slips its way to the southeast, you can see the colder air digging in behind. Snow and ice warnings in force as we head through tonight and into tomorrow. Showers will affect northern and western areas, but it's this band of rain, sleet and snow that pushes its way southwards, giving snow up over the higher grounds and temperatures dropping in its wake. Sub-zero across the north with widespread frost and ice. So a very cold start to the day here. We'll continue to see those wintry showers feeding in, falling as snow to fairly low levels across the far north, but generally as we head into northern England, Northern Ireland and North Wales, it's mostly above 100 to 200 metres. But for the south through Tuesday, a different feeling day, a lot more in the